Hello, and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Carrie Williams, Associate Director of Alumni Events at York University. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first Scholars Hub at Home edition of the academic year, so welcome. We're so pleased to be able to still bring you engaging content from across our faculties Wednesdays at 12 noon. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series and features timely, relevant educational lectures by academics and researchers from across York. We're pleased to be able to continue the series online to allow even more alumni to hear from some of the university's leading scholars. We'd also like to take a moment to thank you for your support of our decision to reschedule last week's Scholars Hub at Home. Last week, we took the opportunity to join the collective call to action to support the movement against anti-Black racism and police violence against Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. We appreciate your support of this decision to stand in solidarity with community. We're pleased to inform you that last week's session called COVID-19 and the Environment, featuring Dr. Mark Winfield, has been rescheduled for Thursday, September 29th at 12 noon. If you had previously registered for last week's session, you do not need to register again. You'll automatically receive a link to join. For those of you who are interested in joining us, if you haven't registered already, please visit, there's a link on your screen, yorku.ca/alumni and friends to register. Along with Dr. Winfield's rescheduled session, we're so thrilled to announce that we will be covering a wide range of topics throughout the fall term, many of which are suggestions you, our audience, shared with us. Topics will include how schools are preparing to go back to school, that's actually next week, social media and bullying, as well as various pertinent and recent scientific advancements. So thanks again for your feedback. Some exciting news from earlier this month. On September 1st, the university announced the creation of the new Faculty of Environment and Urban Change. This faculty brings together the expertise housed in the Faculty of Environmental Studies and the Department of Geography. This new Faculty of Environment and Urban Change is believed to be the first faculty of its kind in the world to bring together a critical mass of physical geographers, ecologists, social scientists, humanities researchers, and artists whose innovative, world-renowned research addresses natural, built, and social spaces from a global perspective. And most recently, just last week, the 2020-2021 academic year began. It goes without saying this year is unique, with the vast majority of courses being delivered remotely. In her address to the community, President Linton said, "We are beginning this academic year with a renewed sense of who we are, what is important to us, and how much we are truly capable of achieving." We welcome you to read the full address at yfile.news.yorku.ca, and that link should come up on your screen now. Although we aren't all in the same location, we recognize many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The areas known as Takronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably care and share for the Great Lakes region. Before we begin today's lecture, we would like to take a quick poll of our audience asking you, that should come up on your screen now, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation, AI? So that should pop up on your screen. I'll give everybody a moment to respond. Let's see here. Great. And we'll just wait for a moment to see the, okay, so the majority, over 50% of you are somewhat informed, and so that's great. And some of you are even new to the topic. So, you know, we really appreciate you taking the time to submit that feedback, because it really helps us, and more importantly, our speaker, have an idea about who's in our audience and the knowledge you have coming into the discussion. So lots of learning opportunity here. If any of you need help with the Zoom platform, please feel free to click on the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen to enter your question. Our team is there to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions to our speaker today as there will be a Q&A session following her lecture. And for those of you who are watching live on Facebook, please feel free to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video, and the team will send them my way. So today's talk is titled Fast Tracking Our Techno-Future, the Unanticipated Effect of COVID-19, featuring Amanda Turnbull, PhD candidate, law. Amanda Turnbull is a doctoral student at Osgoode Hall Law School. Her research investigates the conundrums posed by creative artificial intelligence, AI, technologies, and contributes to reforming and developing the law as we embrace these technologies. Ms. Turnbull is an disciplinary scholar who began her career in the discipline of the arts, teaching music for a number of years before moving to work in a legal environment where she took on a variety of roles, including assistant dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa for almost 8 years. So welcome, Amanda. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Carrie.
Great. So the floor is yours. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here to be able to deliver this Scholars Hub at Home lecture. To say that our lives have changed dramatically since the outbreak of COVID-19 was declared a pandemic is an understatement. The changes that we have experienced have been a direct consequence of the pandemic, such as health effects in the more than 29 million confirmed cases worldwide to date. But there have also been indirect changes. For instance, prior to the pandemic, who could have imagined seeing wild herds of goats running through typically bustling towns like those that were seen in the north coast of Wales? Who could have envisioned peacocks dancing on empty Mumbai streets? Who could have imagined the almost eerie silence in the skies with the reduction of global air traffic? And who could have conceived of robo-dogs like this one named Spot, enforcing social distancing in parks as stay-at-home orders began easing? Spot, here pictured, was piloted by the Singapore government in May 2020. These indirect consequences are externalities or byproducts of pandemic. And they may be negative, such as increased hate speech, which fuels racism and xenophobia in society, but externalities may also be positive. I'm going to speak to you today about some unanticipated positive effects of our pivot to technology during COVID-19 and their potential implications. During health crises such as pandemics, we have historically moved into a societal survival mode, isolating, quarantining, avoiding large gatherings of people, moving to the countryside, and so on and so forth. And that move over time has increasingly pivoted to reliance on our technologies. This has resulted in, somewhat surprisingly, to an increased resilient society. Take, for example, the outbreak of Bubonic Plague in 1300. It lasted for the better part of 500 years. It was devastating, and it killed more than a third of the population of Europe. But the plague also led to inclusive change within society as a result of the development of the printing press, which at the time was a revolutionary technology. The first mechanized printing press using movable type is attributed to Johannes Gutenberg of Mainz, Germany in around 1452. Many scholars argue that Gutenberg was in the right place at the right time for unveiling his new form of technology. Mainz was an ideal location. Gutenberg was able to make use of grape pressing technology to devise his movable press. But the printing press was also an externality of the Bubonic Plague. Survivors of the plague acquired the property of those who died. So this included land, buildings, and money, but also clothing, bedding, and other types of cloth. Eventually, there was a surplus of cloth, and by the end of the 14th century, this resulted in the manufacturing of what was called rag paper. Taking its name from the rag and bone man, who collected bones, as well as old clothing, rag paper was made from excess fabric and provided an impetus for the invention of printing. By about 1450, there was an oversupply of rag paper, and its price fell to a low level, thus increasing the affordability of printed books. And what this led to was greater circulation of knowledge within the population. And with greater literacy and with that came greater literacy and the rise of the reading public. At the time the Gutenberg Press was invented, the literacy rate in Europe was less than 10%. By 1800, it grew to over 50%. So we could say that the literacy divide in the population decreased substantially, resulting in a more inclusive society, all of which arose as an unanticipated consequence of the development of paper and printing during the plague years. This link of technology, in this case, the technologizing of the written word, and health, may be seen as a trend that has continued as an unanticipated consequence of other outbreaks of disease. The smallpox epidemic in 1721 in Boston, for instance, arguably resulted in the development of the independent newspaper in America. The New England Courant, founded by James Franklin and his brother Benjamin, who would go on and do great things after his stint in the publishing business, saw the opportunity to start up his newspaper and disseminate the controversy over whether to use inoculation as the most effective manner of controlling the spread of smallpox. This slide shows, slightly out of focus, but an edition of 1722 New England Courant with a letter written by Mrs. Silence Dogood, who actually was Benjamin Franklin's pen name. The paper gave the country its first taste of a free press and marked the path toward freedom of expression in America. Free press and freedom of expression are factors in promoting an inclusive society. The significance here? Well, the dissemination of the technologized word through the format of the newspaper during an epidemic is further affirmation between this link between technology and health. The telephone is another example of a technology, this time the technologizing of the spoken word, that we have turned to during a health crisis. In this case, the universal telephone was marketed as a remedy to quarantining, as this ad from 1910 demonstrates. You can see that it advertises the telephone's potential to help people cope with isolation. And it turned out not to be just a marketing campaign. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, for instance, merchants in Los Angeles began offering teleshopping to customers in order to help prevent the spread of influenza. Also, high school students in California had regular phone conversations with their teachers during lockdown. This was arguably a form of proto-distance education. And remember, this is over 100 years ago. However, although the telephone was marketed as a universal service, the reality was quite different. Only 35% of homes in the US had a telephone by 1920. So what this meant was that at least 65% of the population was unable to access the services being offered through the use of the telephone to minimize exposure to the flu during the 1918 outbreak. And what ended up happening during this outbreak was that the telephone operators, who were mainly women, that manually connected each caller and recipient, were set up in a kind of elbow to elbow working conditions. And they started getting sick with the flu due to working in such proximity. So ultimately, the public was asked to stay off the phone unless it was an emergency. The upshot? Well, the pivot to telecommunications technology during the 1918 pandemic clearly demonstrated a telecommunications divide within society. It also showed the telephone was not sufficiently automated to be an invaluable social support during the flu pandemic. In other words, another design approach was needed to avoid the human in the loop. But the unanticipated consequence of the 1918 pandemic was that more inclusive and more automated telecommunications technology could be used as a form of protection during a health crisis. Again, a clear link between technology and health. Fast forward through time to 2020, and many of us have experienced an extraordinary and accelerated pivot to digital technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic. What's the evidence of this? Well, many of us reverted to remote work and online education during the initial lockdown. We have also seen artificial intelligence, data science, and technology all used in the tracking of infectious disease, AI helping to diagnose the virus, technology being used in processing health claims, drones delivering medical supplies, algorithms being used to develop drugs, ultraviolet D robots being put to use to clean hospitals, to clean restaurants and grocery stores. We've seen chatbots and call centers. We've seen digital government services, virtually witnessing documents, conducting trials and other court proceedings online, and the list goes on and on. This amplified use of technology has been critical to how we've coped with the unfamiliar circumstances arising out of COVID-19. And the premise behind this is so simple. Machines don't get sick. Our technologies help protect us from contagion. Again, the clear link between technology and health emerges. However, the protection offered by our technologies is only available to those who can access them. Statistics show that 97% of the world population lives within the reach of a mobile cellular signal, and that 93% live within the reach of a 3G or higher network. Statistics also show that the use of the internet is continually growing, with 4.1 billion people accessing it. This figure translates roughly into 53.6% of the global population, but it also reflects that 46.4% remain offline. Internet use is highest in Europe at about 82.5% and lowest in Africa at 28.2%, where affordability and digital literacy remain key barriers to uptake and use. There's also a gap in gender. 48% of women globally are making use of the internet versus 58% of men. However, the rate is near parity in the Americas. There's also a gap in age. 9% of the world population was over the age of 65 in 2019. And according to available data in Canada and the US and Europe, between 30 to 40% of that group remains offline. In less developed countries, older persons are least likely of all age groups to have access to digital technologies. We know that COVID-19 affects all segments of the population, but we also know that one of its most shocking features is its disproportionate impact on older persons. They are most vulnerable and have a higher risk of mortality and developing severe disease following the viral infection. Our initial pivot to digital technologies in this health crisis left out more than 30% of the population who are most vulnerable to the disease. This gap is referred to as the digital divide, and generally accepted factors that affect access and use of the digital technologies include not only age, but income, race, ethnicity, gender, and geography. This divide posed further harm to the most vulnerable group during the initial phase of COVID-19. More than 30% of older persons did not have access to crucial pandemic information, nor did they have access to telehealth or telemedicine, nor to grocers who began offering priority e-commerce access in order to help get food to them safely. The use of health tracking applications and medication management could also have been useful and helpful in reducing social interactions between staff at long-term care facilities and residents. In emerging from this initial crisis of COVID-19, we see that increased access to and use of technologies would have reduced the impact of isolation on older persons. And in fact, we are now seeing official health recommendations to increase access to digital technologies for older persons in order to minimize social isolation and loneliness. Both of these are known to heighten risk of cardiovascular, autoimmune, neurocognitive, and mental health problems. While digital inclusion has long been understood to be tied to human rights and to improving the Human Development Index in developing countries, our pivot to technology during COVID-19 has demonstrated that, in fact, technology is tied specifically and inextricably to the right to health. The right to health is a fundamental aspect of our human rights and of our understanding of what it means to have a life in dignity. It's an inclusive right and includes a vast range of factors that may help in leading a healthy existence. But full content of the right to health has never been fully expressed. What we are now seeing emerging as a result of COVID-19 and its impact on older persons is that the right to digital technologies ought to be included. Past pandemics have shown us the unanticipated consequence that pivoting to technology results in increased societal resilience in the longer term. The Bubonic Plague played a role in bridging the literacy divide in society, while the Boston smallpox epidemic contributed to promoting more inclusiveness in society through the freedom of expression. The 1918 influenza outbreak showed that more automated telecommunications technology could be used as a form of protection during health crisis. And COVID-19 has followed the route toward inclusive change in providing us with the opportunity to deal with the digital divide by squarely tying technology with the right to health. Our pivot to technology hasn't been perfect, since we know that our technologies amplify the existing social inequalities that are woven into society. But by recognizing this, and in thinking about technology as a type of care, it gives us the opportunity to imagine and create a world in which everyone thrives. Author and activist Arundhati Roy has described pandemics as portals, kind of gateways between one world and the next. As a portal, COVID-19 has pointed us on the path towards digital inclusion as part of a right to health. Resolving this also has consequences for how we govern or moderate online expression. There has been strong consensus by freedom of expression experts that regulation of speech through platform law, that is to say, larger social media companies who control their own platform on the basis of terms of service and community standards, fails to provide sufficient transparency and protection for freedom of expression and other human rights. An alternative to platform law is applying international human rights law. But international human rights norms aren't a cure-all for online speech regulation, since these laws are found in a variety of international and regional treaties, as well as being subject to conflicting interpretations. However, paring down the general human rights platform to the more particular right to health, as we may prove to be more effective. As we emerge from the pandemic, we should be mindful of the unanticipated positive effects of accelerating or fast-tracking our digital technologies. Fears about technology and concerns about taking it over obscure the evidence that pivoting to technology constitutes a form of caremongering. So I believe I reached the end of my talk, and this is over to Carrie.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for that. It's such a constructive sort of lens to look at this through, like the unintended consequences of the pandemic. It's just really a constructive and refreshing way to look at it. We now do have time for our audience to ask any questions that they may have of you. We do have a few already. And if you're watching us on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And again, those of you on Facebook, you can just submit your questions using the comment box and the team will get them my way. So are you ready for some questions?
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, okay, great. So this question actually picks up on sort of where you were going towards the end of your talk around human rights. A question from Michael. What are your thoughts about the possibility of the Trudeau government in next week's throne speech committing to the idea of free internet access for Canadians as a human right?
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, I know.
Unanticipated question.
Yeah.
Well, it would certainly be it would certainly be interesting to contemplate. I mean, satellites in space provide us with internet access. And so on the one hand, it would be relatively easy to do, but on the other hand, you know, implementing how we charge, how we don't charge, how we,
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many, it's a complicated question. So it would be very interesting if you did.
Yeah, and you know what, maybe even part of this is a thought that it should be, and you know, it should be a human right, and you know, what would it take to do that? Another question for you, what are some of the challenges older persons experience in terms of use in relation to digital technologies?
Well, that's a good, that's very topical. There's a number of barriers, and they can be grouped into kind of internal as well as external. So the external, I mentioned some of them that are present already when we discuss the digital divide: income, ethnicity, education, gender. These things all have impact, as well as ageism, so a discrimination on the basis of age, as well as internal barriers, so digital literacy. Many of the, much of the population, not much of, but part of the population who is now over 65 never experienced digital technologies in their work life, and so their digital literacy would have to increase. Some of older persons experience what we refer to as technophobia, so they're fearful of using technologies. There's functional impairment. When we think about things like iPhones, they're designed for a younger mindset. They're designed for younger functionality. The buttons on keyboards may be too small to read. So there's some functional impairments there, as well as cognitive impairment. But there is a field known as gerund technology that arose in the 1990s in Europe that does.
Oh, she's frozen there. Oh, you're back. Oh, you cut off at gerund technology that was created in Europe?
Yeah, so there is a field that studies the types of barriers that older persons experience when dealing with technologies.
Right, okay, great, thank you for that. Another question for you, what role do you think technology will play in a post-pandemic society with regards to daily functions? Will we ever have to leave our homes again?
Well, I hope so, because my home's not all that big.
Same.
I think that in a post-pandemic society, we have some new responsibilities that have come to light, right? We're increasingly aware of safety in a way, health safety in a way that we weren't in the past. We've become more accustomed, in its pros and its cons, to remote work. I think there has an accelerated use of AI and data science for drug discovery. So there's sort of a focus on health. But the idea that technology has care, or a society that cares more through its use of technology, I think is something that's kind of novel in a way. We thought previously technology more about pushing frontiers, gaining wealth, but or imposing on human rights. But what about the aspect of a form of care? So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no. Well, it's interesting. We have another question in from the audience, sort of picking up on care, if you don't mind if I keep going. So this audience member says she's been concerned, or he, I'm not sure, has been concerned about the disappearance of compassion in healthcare through COVID. So while technology is opening up options for people to have access to health, we also need to remember, for example, a 25-year-old who's getting terminal diagnosis but needs support in person, as an example.
Right.
Both from family and from healthcare professionals. So her question, or the question, I keep saying her, but the question is, yep. Does history demonstrate that function and convenience is priority over the compassion? What do you think?
Well, I don't.
Or can they exist equally, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I think machines keep us alive, right? But we really need human faces to feel comforted. So there's certain things that can't be replaced. They can be supplemented. They can increase our resilience and our safety, but I don't think you can replace the comfort of as I said, human face.
Right. Yeah, and I'm wondering, I guess, what could be happening in the pandemic is things are happening in the pandemic where a typical response that could involve both care and, like you said, the machines that don't get sick, not necessarily happening in that way. One thing gets compromised, I guess, is what this attendee is sort of getting at. It's like something gets compromised in that, and it's not going to be the machine because the machine doesn't get sick, right? It's going to be perhaps the compassionate side. Thanks for that. One more question. How would you describe, I think one more question, how would you describe technology as an extension of the human body? Do you believe this is the case?
Well, I think you could think about it as prosthesis. So yes, in a way, but through the lens of what it means to be a human being, rather than through the means to imagine what it's like to be artificial or a machine. So it's it goes back to the last point, machines can keep us alive, but it really takes the human touch. You can't substitute the human touch and the human face to feel comforted.
Right. You know what, we do have one more. There's so much in your lecture that was about the positive outcomes, right? The unintended consequences that were actually really positive, the printing press and the use of the telephone, like really, really positive things. So it's really exciting to think about, well, what does this mean for us? And obviously it will come clear with time. This one last question we have from the audience is asking for your thoughts, Amanda, about the negative consequences of rapidly expanding AI technology. And the examples they give is such as like military applications or the surveillance of populations.
Right. So it's a really curious question. So I chose to talk about the positive aspects of pandemic today, but I've actually been co-writing a paper with one of my PhD law colleagues. His name is Kenneth Grad, and his part of the paper focuses on the negative consequences of pandemic. He refers to it as pandemic's penumbra, so the constant companion of disease. On the one hand, you have the positives, on the other, you have these negative externalities. And what he talks about is the rise in hate speech. And he goes back through the same pandemics that I mentioned in my talk, and he looks at the types of hate speech that came about as a result of pandemic, and our need as kind of our very human need to blame people, and how do we deal with that? And so yes, there's definitely the flip side to the positive externalities. One of them being negative. One of the negative externalities being hate speech. As you mentioned, things like weaponized AI, threatening AI. AI can also help amplify existing problems in society, right?
Right. Okay.
So as I said, I tried to concentrate on the positive side of pandemic penumbra, but yes, for sure, there exists the negative externalities as well.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, it's a very constructive sort of lens to look at this through. So it's really helpful. We have one last question, and then we will pretty much be at time. This question comes from the audience. We know too much screen time, I guess, as a form of technology. It's always on a piece of technology, isn't recommended for children. Do you think that will change because of COVID-19?
Well, I mean, I think you have to try and strike a balance, right? If we're going to spend X period in front of a screen each day as a substitute for attending school, we know from attending school that children lose interest after a while. They need to take breaks. And I think the same things ought to apply when we're dealing with screen time. I mean, I'm not an expert on screen time, but it would seem reasonable to me that we take breaks, that we figure out what recess means when we're sitting staring at screens for too long. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to have to be consideration for aspects like that.
Right. Is there I mean, child behavior, you need to sort of build those things. What I'm hearing you say is you have to build those things in regardless of what they're doing, whether they're on screen or they're in class. You have to build in that flexibility. Do you think that when you think about the people who are sort of designing AI technology, designers, engineers, developers, if we sort of take out, or even if we want to take the same lens of children as an example, or at large, what do you think those designers and engineers should be focusing on in this pandemic?
Well, that's a type of health consideration too, right? So if you are designing technologies with health in mind, you might think differently about how you design light filters on screens and eyes. And so I think it just sort of doubles back to my point about thinking about technology as care, as about, and linking it to health. How does that change how we develop our technologies, how we govern our technologies?
What we prioritize in that as well. That's been wonderful. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us and for sharing this work with us. It's just great. It's great to have this level of analysis and review that we're able to share from our faculty. So thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today.
Okay. And just before we say goodbye to you and our audience, thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. We have one last poll question for you. And the question is, now that you've heard Amanda Turnbull speak, how would you rate your knowledge of AI technologies in the pandemic? It should pop up in your screen right now, and I'll give everybody a moment to respond. Thank you so much for participating in that. Now, feel free to share. We did see a question come in there if today's talk would be recorded, and yes, it has been, and it will be shared. And so we would welcome you to please share it with your friends. It will be posted on our York Alumni YouTube channel. You may also join our LinkedIn group or follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at YorkU Alumni. So that's @YorkU Alumni. Feedback about this or any of our programming is most welcome. As you know, we take it in and we plan based on your feedback. It can be sent to us via any of those social channels or email directly at alumni@yorku.ca. Scholars Hub at Home is back Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time. Join us Wednesday, September 23rd, next Wednesday, for Back to School Prep, strategies to help your kids succeed in math and promote family literacy. To learn more about that and see the rest of our September lineup, please visit us at yorku.ca/alumni and friends and click on events. Thank you so much, and be well.